Today we're going to be talking about the places you should go and the things that you should see if you're going to Ypres for one day. Hey guys, welcome to another video back here in my little studio office space. And that's because today we're doing a video all about Ypres in a day. Now let's just touch on that first, the pronunciation of Ypres. In this video, I'm going to pronounce it Ypres, but there's lots of different ways that it gets pronounced and different ways that it has been historically pronounced. You'll often hear it pronounced Ypres, or by the locals, Ypres. Back during the Great War, the local British Tommies there in that area often would have called it Wipers. But for the sake of this video, I'm going to go with probably one of the more sort of widely recognised pronunciations, which is Ypres. Kind of Yp and then like R on the end, Ypres. The last piece is very sort of mildly pronounced. So that's what I'm going to go with. People can tell me I'm wrong, that's totally fine. So today, we're going to talk about Ypres in a day. If you're going to go to Ypres for one day, what are the places that you should include into your itinerary? We did a video like this about the Somme, and it was quite popular, and a lot of people messaged me, some in the comments and some outside of that through Facebook, Instagram, just to say like thank you, and they found it useful. So I thought it might be useful to do one on Ypres as well. Now this is just going to be a few spots that I recommend, places that I think are good to go, that give you kind of an overview of what you can see when you're in that area. If you go to the Ypres Salient, you could spend a lot of days there. You could look at so many different sites, so many fascinating sites, and a lot of them you could go there briefly and have a little look, or you could walk around them for 3-4 hours. And so this really is a snapshot. But if you've only got one day, what can you do to get the most of your trip? And hopefully that's what this video will be useful for. So a few things to position. Similar to the Somme video, I'm assuming that if you're traveling over there, you have access to a car. That's going to be fairly important to be able to get you around the different sites nice and easily without having to worry about public transport. I'm also assuming that maybe you're going to be staying in the centre of town. So we're going to start our trip in the centre of Ypres, and I'm assuming that you've got the ability to stay around for the whole day right into the evening. Now, the reason I say that is because we're going to end our day's tour with a really important part of it, which is going to happen at 8 o'clock in the evening. Lots of you will already know what I'm talking about, but we'll save that for later in the video, because I do think it's one of the most important things and one of the most powerful experiences you can have during your visit to Ypres. Okay, so let's start our day. We're kind of assuming that we're probably starting around sort of 9 o'clock in the morning. You're probably staying somewhere in the centre of town. So the first thing we're going to do is just take a short drive, not too far, probably about 7-8 minutes drive, something like that, a little bit north to an area called Bozinger, and we're going to go to the Essex Farm Cemetery. Now, this is a cemetery that was used from 1915 through and also in 1917 as well. But it's a cemetery that has a couple of really interesting things about it. This cemetery is an area that was used as an advanced dressing station. It sat just a little bit behind the British lines in 1915. And it is here at the cemetery in May 1915 when a famous Canadian by the name of John McCrae wrote the poem In Flanders Fields. Really fascinating spot. And when you go to the cemetery, just to kind of the back left, they have some of the bunkers. That is the area that was used as the advanced dressing station. Now those have been kind of recreated slightly. They've been modernised a little bit with some concrete compared to what they would have been at the time, but they're still original. That is where they were. That is the right site. And it is around that area where John McCrae was working when he was inspired to write his poem In Flanders Fields. If you go there, you'll see they've got an information plaque about it, and that's really interesting. And it's incredible just to stand there and have that experience. That's where he was. That's when he had those emotions that led to him to write that poem. Now, I did do a video about the cemetery and about the poem. I'm going to link it up the top here if you want to go check that one out. But maybe make a note of it, watch the rest of this video, then you can go back and check that one afterwards. Now, of course, it's well worth having a look around the cemetery in general. There's a couple of memorials here at the cemetery, a couple of bits of information, but also a couple of interesting graves. And one which I would definitely recommend that you go to is the grave of Valentine Joe Strudwick. He was only 15 years old when he was killed in this area, and he was one of the youngest soldiers to be killed on the Western Front. It's a very well decorated grave when you go there. Lots of school trips and stuff like that come to it. But it's one that you should visit. If you go to Essex Farm Cemetery, you definitely want to take the time to visit that grave. Okay, so we're finishing up at Essex Farm. Probably only going to have been there for maybe an hour maximum, probably a little bit less than that actually. I'd say half an hour is enough time to have a little walk around and see what's going on. And from here, we're going to take another probably less than 10 minutes drive over to Langemarck. We're going to the German cemetery at Langemarck. So some of you who are familiar with the area of Ypres will know why I've included this cemetery. And some people might be thinking, whoa, it's surprising to include a German cemetery during a one-day visit to Ypres. But I think it's a really important place to go. Langemarck German Cemetery has the graves of more than 44,000 German soldiers. 44,000. And just over half of those are buried in one communal grave. Like a mass grave it's often described as, but there's a little bit more to it than that. It's a fascinating cemetery and one that I really recommend you go to. If you want to go to Ypres and learn about the history around there, it's important to recognise the German sacrifice that also took place there during the war. Of course, there were huge masses, hundreds of thousands of casualties in this area on both sides. But the Germans suffered tremendously here as well. And by going to Langemarck Cemetery, I think you really understand or start to have the feeling of the impact that it had on both sides. There's some stuff to see here as well. You can take a walk around. Towards the kind of back, sort of right of the cemetery, you'll see a series of bunkers. That is pretty much where the German front line came through during a period of the war here in 1917. But as well as that, there is just a lot of history here. And in fact, there's some World War II related history at Langemarck as well. The famous Austrian with a little moustache during World War II or in the earlier part of World War II, he actually visited Langemarck Cemetery himself and used it for some propaganda photos and stuff. You can find those if you jump on Google. I also made a video here at Langemarck which talks a little bit about that. Again, I'm going to link that one up the top here. So that's our fascinating visit to the Langemarck Cemetery. And from here, we're going to take another little drive, again, probably about 10 minutes, and we're going down to a Commonwealth cemetery this time. We're going to the famous Tynecott Cemetery. So the Tynecott Cemetery. Here at Tynecott, you will be visiting the largest Commonwealth grave cemetery in the world. And it is a site that you absolutely must go to if you go to Ypres. You go there and it is one of those places where you can really feel the weight of the history and what happened in that area and what that cemetery represents. A couple of logistical bits before we go on to the cemetery itself. When you kind of arrive there, depending on how you've got it into your Google Maps, you might arrive at the front where there's kind of sort of the archway gate, or it might take you to the visitor centre at the back. The visitor centre at the back is the best spot for you to go to. You can park easily there. There's some toilets and stuff there as well if you need to use those, and the visitor centre is up there at the back as well. Now you can walk through into the cemetery from the back. You kind of come through sort of by the memorial to the missing, and we'll talk about that in just a minute. But if it's your first time going there, I would actually recommend walking around the outside and come in the front gate. You can't necessarily park by the front gate. I mean, you can fit a couple of cars there, but it's quite tight. But it's worth it because this cemetery is kind of on a slope, and when you walk through that front gate, you really see the impact of what that cemetery is about. It is absolutely huge. There's more than 11,000 burials here, and more than 8,000 of those are unidentified. That in itself speaks volumes to the type of fighting that went on here and the awful loss of men into the ground, into the mud, who weren't identified when they were later buried. There's also the memorial to the missing, which is the wall along the back of the Tynecott Cemetery. It's got the names of more than 33,000 men who were missing again from this area. Now there's another big memorial to the missing in Ypres town centre, which we'll get to, and I'll talk then about sort of what's the difference between that one and the one here at Tynecott. Now when you come to Tynecott, there's lots of different bits here that are well worth looking around. You can see some of the original bunkers which still sit in the cemetery. Those were German bunkers, defensive bunkers, that were attacked by the Commonwealth forces here, specifically the Australians, as they pushed through this area in 1917. When you walk around, it's well worth getting onto sort of Google and stuff before you go to the cemetery. And in fact, I made a video all about the cemetery again. I'll link it up the top right here, because you can visit the graves of several recipients of the Victoria Cross when you're here at Tyncott, and it's really worth doing that and reading some of those stories of those men whilst you're by the graves. And again, the memorial to the missing. There's some Victoria Cross winners on the memorial as well, and you can go and read about those whilst you're there. And it's worth just having a wander around and just really kind of taking in the amount of names that are there on that wall. At the back is the visitor centre. Well worth taking a look into the visitor centre. There's some really cool information in there. I think it changes sometimes, but ultimately they're talking about some of the men who are buried or commemorated at Tyncott Cemetery. So it's really worth checking it out. Now, here at Tyncott, you're kind of starting to work your way around that Ypres Salient at this stage. We're kind of into sort of the kind of northeastern part of that bulge around Ypres. And out here, we're in the direction of Passchendaele, often referred to as Passchendaele, the Battle of Passchendaele, the third Battle of Ypres in 1917. It's through this area where that part of the battle was fought. And so where we're going to go next is actually just slightly further northeast from here at Tyncott towards the village of Passchendaele. Now, if we had a little bit more time, I'd actually really recommend walking this because it's a fascinating walk. We're actually going to drive. It's only about 3-4 minutes drive. And as you drive northeast, you're going to be heading towards the Canadian Memorial at Passchendaele. If you type into your Google Maps or your sat-nav, Passchendaele Canadian Memorial, it's going to take you to the right spot. And it's just about a 3 or 4 minute drive. But when you drive this 3 or 4 minutes, take your time, drive slow and have a look out the window as you go, because you are driving through the area that really would have represented the essence of what that Battle of Passchendaele was about. This is where that mud was. This is where the water was, the flooding, the absolute quagmire that these men fought their way through. And as you move up towards the Canadian Memorial, you're into the area where the Canadians made their final push towards the village of Passchendaele itself. Now again, I've made a video about this one. I made a video where I did walk this area, and I recommend checking that one out. I found it really interesting walking it, and hopefully you'll enjoy checking that out as well. Again, I'm going to link that up the top just here. So when you arrive at the Canadian Memorial, you're in an area that was known as Crest Farm. It was captured by the Canadian 4th Division at the end of October 1917. Now, if you park up your car here and walk into where the memorial is, and you look towards the village of Passchendaele, you can see the church spire in the middle of the village. And what you're looking across here is that final piece of ground that the Canadians had to push through in order to capture that final part of the village. This short distance that you're looking across here took those men nearly 10 days to fight their way across. That's how thick the mud was and how bad the defences were and how heavy the defences that they were going against were. 10 days to get across just this small section. You'll also see the Canada Gate Memorial there. This is one of 2 memorials. There is one of these in Canada, which kind of represents the final steps that those Canadian soldiers took on Canadian ground before they boarded the ships to head over to Europe to fight in the Great War. And this gate represents the final steps that many of those men took as they went into that attack towards Passchendaele, and of course thousands of them never returned. A really moving memorial actually, that, and one that's really worthwhile taking the time to have a wander around and check it out. On this visit, we're not going to head into the village of Passchendaele itself, mainly because we've only got one day and we've got an awful lot more to see. But if you had a bit more time, you definitely could do. So depending on how long you've taken to have a look around the site so far, we're probably getting into like a late lunchtime by this point. And that's okay, because we're going to go somewhere for lunch right now. We're going to take you guys on probably about a 10-12 minute drive, something like that. I don't know for sure, I should have looked up these drive times, but I'm guessing it's about that long. Down towards the Hoog Crater Museum. Now they have a really fascinating museum there, and we're going to touch on that in just a second, but they also have a really nice little cafe there. I've eaten lunch there a couple of times myself, definitely recommend it. That's a great place to have a little stop off, have some food, have a drink, use the toilet facilities, and we're also going to take a look in the museum and also the cemetery just over the road, the Hoog Crater Cemetery. Now, the museum here at Hoog, it's not a huge museum. It's a museum that actually is part of a private collection, but it's probably one of the best museums in the Ypres area, at least I believe. Now, there's lots of other museums as well. There's the In Flanders Fields Museum in the centre of town. There's also the Passchendaele Museum, but I really like the Hoog Crater Museum, and it's also one that's good to visit when we've only got one day, because it takes a little bit less time to walk around. It's not too expensive. You pay a little fee, get your lunch first, then pay a little fee and go have a wander around the museum. They've got such a great collection of stuff in there. And I'm somebody who loves a museum where you're kind of looking at artifacts rather than just reading information. And this museum definitely is one of those. They have so much stuff packed into a small space. They also have some bits in there that are actually artifacts related to some of the men who are buried in the Hoog Crater Cemetery over the road. So after you finish visiting the museum, definitely step over the road to have a look in the cemetery. The cemetery here has nearly 6,000 burials. About 3,500 of those are unidentified. Now, this is an area that was fought over very heavily. There was lots of fighting here in the earlier part of the war, and in fact, this is the site where the Germans used flamethrowers for the first time against British troops in 1915. It's an area that had lots of fighting, was captured by the British in 1917. It's an area that was recaptured by the Germans during their spring offensive in 1918. It's an area that changed hands a fair few times and lots of fighting in this area. But it's a really fascinating cemetery and one which I really recommend taking the time to have a wander around and have a look. Quick recommendation here, Paul Reed at the Old Front Line, he's done a video where he walks a bit of this area and talks about the flamethrower attack and stuff like that. Really recommend checking that one out. I'll try and get that one into the link in the description below, because he is somebody who just knows so much about this area, and I certainly found that video interesting, so it's well worth checking that one out. Okay, we're probably mid-afternoon by this stage, so we're going to take about another 10-minute drive to go to our kind of last visit around the Salient for today, apart from heading into the centre of town. We're going to head down towards Hill 60. Now, there is a little car park here by Hill 60. I think actually if you put Hill 60 car park into your Google Maps, it takes you to the right spot. This is a really interesting site where we're going to take a little walk around, probably a good sort of half hour, maybe 45 minutes walk around this area, because it really is fascinating. You're going to take a park up there and head in to have a look around Hill 60. Now, Hill 60 is a fascinating place just to walk around. They've built kind of like a boardwalk there, and it's really cool to have a walk through and along, and they're actually marked on those boards at different points where the British front lines were and where the German front lines were, and you can see here how incredibly close together they were. That's something which you really realise on this area when you walk through here, is how close those front lines were to each other. Now, again, this is an area that had fighting right through the war. There was fighting here in the earlier part of the war, in the middle of the war, at the end of the war. Pretty much all of the Ypres Salient had fighting right around it. But of course, there were bigger events in different areas at different times. And one of the more famous events around Hill 60 was in 1917, when a huge number of mines were blown in this area as part of the Battle of Messines. And in this area, Hill 60, the top part of the hill was pretty much blown away by a huge British mine that was placed underneath it. Now, it wasn't just one mine, there were a series of mines through this area. And one of the things they've got here is the Caterpillar mine crater, where you can walk through and see the resulting damage of one of these huge mines. It's full of water now, and I'm assuming it's full of water year round. I've never seen it not full of water, so I think it must be the entire time now. But you can really see the side of that crater and how big that mine was that exploded there in June 1917. There's also some German bunker positions when you walk around this area too. And there's an awful lot you can see. It's one that's really worth taking the time to explore and have a look around Hill 60. Now, I actually haven't done a video at Hill 60. My friend Chris over Vlogging Through History has. He's done a really interesting video over there. So worthwhile checking that one out. And again, I will link that one in the description below so you can go and see somebody else's video about Hill 60. So by the time you get to finish your little walk around the Hill 60 area, we're probably going to be into the late afternoon. And what I'm going to suggest this time is it's time to head back to your hotel, head back to your accommodation in Ypres, and get yourself ready for the evening. Now, if you're an early diner, you might want to go get some dinner before 8 o'clock. Otherwise, you can go get some dinner afterwards, but we are going to head down to the Menin Gate, the Menin Gate Memorial to the Missing, for the last post ceremony, which happens at 8 o'clock every single day. And it is something that is such a moving experience. And if you go to Ypres, you must go to the last post ceremony there at the Menin Gate. The Menin Gate Memorial to the Missing has the names of nearly 55,000 men who were lost during the Great War and have no known grave. Now, earlier on at Tynecott, of course, we saw the Tynecott Memorial to the Missing. So briefly, what's the difference between the two? Well, there were so many men who were missing that they had to draw the line. They had to range at a cut-off point at some point for the Menin Gate. So men who were killed after the 15th of August 1917, rather than being named on the Menin Gate, are named on the Tynecott Memorial. So the Menin Gate here represents men who were killed or missing up until the 15th of August 1917. Casualties from beyond that are named on the Tynecott Memorial. So that's briefly the difference between the two. There's a bit more to it than that, but that gives you the rough summary. So here at the Menin Gate, they have the last post ceremony. It's at 8 p.m. Every night, and they have the buglers out there and they play the last post, and it's such a moving experience. Now, it gets very busy. I have been there on days when it's actually a fair bit quieter, but I've been there on days when it is absolutely packed. So I actually recommend getting down there by kind of at least sort of 7:30, maybe even slightly earlier than that. I've been there before at sort of 7 p.m. and crowds have started to build up. If you're staying nearby in Ypres, hopefully you can walk there. If not, the square around the Cloth Hall is a good spot to park, and you can head down to the Menin Gate. You're going to be there for probably about half an hour plus your waiting time beforehand, only until sort of 20 past, 8:30, something like that, and you'll be done and leaving the area. Either before, if you get there a lot earlier, or afterwards. I really recommend having a walk around and read some of the names on the panels. At the point of recording this video, some of the memorial is still closed off, where they've been doing some important restoration work, but I believe that's coming to an end. So hopefully very soon you'll be able to get back and have a real good look around the memorial, and you'll be able to see all the panels and all of the names on those panels. That's the most important thing, the names of those men on those panels. After you've finished walking around and taking in that moving ceremony, your day around Ypres is pretty much finished. I'm going to recommend you round off by heading back down to that square by the Cloth Hall. There is so much history in that square. Thousands of men passed through that area during the Great War. And it's a great spot just to sit and have a meal. I've been to a few of the restaurants around that square and had some nice meals there. You can have a drink and think of what happened in that area. Think of so many of the men who passed through that area to never return. The men who are in these cemeteries, who are named on those memorials. I hope you found that video interesting. Hopefully that's given you an idea of what you can do on Ypres in a day. Now, of course, I did miss lots out. We didn't go to places like Polygon Wood. Yorkshire Trench I've done a video at. So many really cool sites that you can go to around Ypres that we just simply did not have time for today. Now, spoiler alert, we might visit some of those places in my Ypres in 2 days video, but Ypres in a day. Those are the spots that I would recommend. Other people might recommend different ones. Like I said, there's so much you can do around Ypres. You can head west to places like Poppering. You can do more in the south, where we spent a little bit of time on this video. But hopefully this gives you a rough idea. If you did like it and you think you would find it interesting, or you will find it useful, if you're planning a trip, do me a favor, hit the like button, do all the YouTube stuff for me. It helps me out loads and loads on this channel. If there is somewhere else that you would have recommended, maybe there's something that you would have left out from my itinerary and you would have included somewhere different, that's totally cool. Let everybody know in the comments below, because it's always good to get multiple opinions on something like this. Guys, thank you very much for watching. I hope you enjoyed it, and I will see you on the next video.